Today we're going to learn how to make sourdough bread. The reason is that so many women keep coming to my house asking, how can I make sourdough bread? Also some guys, but mostly women, asking how to make sourdough bread and what is sourdough bread, because we eat fresh sourdough bread every single day in our home and serve it at our Shabbat table. And when it's nice and fresh and warm, people really love it and they want to know how to make it. So I figure I'll do a video lesson because not every single one of you is going to have the opportunity to come into my kitchen and learn hands-on. So the first thing that we do is take our sourdough starter. I keep my sourdough starter in a glass container. You could put it in a plastic container, but glass is always best. And you take the entire starter and put it in your bowl. Any bowl will do. Pottery makes it a little prettier and a little more fun. So then we add water. You're going to find this entire process is really, really simple, and it's going to shock you a little bit. And if you've eaten my sourdough bread, you're going to be less impressed with us now that you've seen how we do it. Normally what we do is we do this and walk away and just allow on its own, just from natural process of osmosis, for water to go into the dough and soften it, and it sort of spreads out and becomes a lot more soupy. We'll go for like 10-15 minutes. You can go for half an hour, you can go for an hour. It doesn't really matter that much, but 10 minutes is perfectly enough. But since we're having a video session and we want to move things along, we're going to start to mix the sourdough into the water. So the first thing I'm sure you're going to ask is, well, what is sourdough? How did you get this thing into the container? So I'm going to explain what sourdough is. Basically, all around me right now, are tons of little eensy-weensy, millions and millions of eensy-weensy bacteria and yeast and fungi. They're constantly crawling everywhere. And they really like to eat sugar, just like we really like to eat sugar. So if you leave a fruit salad, or if you leave milk, or if you leave any other food that has any amount of sugar in it, which is pretty much all food, on the counter, what you're going to see is overnight it's going to go bad, or it's going to ferment. So going bad means that it's attracted so many fungi and mold that it just gets really nasty and gnarly and might grow like a whole bunch of gray fuzz, which is disgusting. The other option that might happen is that it might ferment, which is that mostly bacteria and yeast have come and populated the food. Let's say it's a fruit salad, and bubbles start to form. So those bubbles are carbon dioxide that are a product of the process of the bacteria breaking down the grain, and they kind of, to be blunt, fart. So what happens if you take flour and water, this will work with any flour and water. If you mix the flour and water and you put it on the counter, after about 3 days, you will have a soured dough. The dough goes through a process of the bacteria that are naturally in the air coming and attacking all of that yummy, delicious flour that's chock full of sugar, and they just break down the complex carbohydrates into simple carbohydrates. They break down the complex proteins into simple proteins. The carbohydrates happen first. And throughout that process, they're going to be expelling carbon dioxide and making the dough fluffier. That's where all the holes in your bread come from, are from that carbon dioxide. So they're going to make the dough fluffier, and they're also going to break it down. So you start with something that's a bit more firm, and as the dough gets broken down, it starts to become more soupy and comes to smell something like, I'm smelling this right now. This smells exactly to me like cheese. Smells like cheese or like beer. If it smells like somebody's locker room, it needs to go into the garbage, and you can either make your own sourdough starter or get sourdough starter from someone else. If you ever want to get sourdough starter from me, I'm more than happy to give it to you over and over again, as many times as you need. Hopefully you'll have your sourdough lasting for a really long time. So I have, for some concocted reason, never been successful at making my own sourdough. I always get it from a bakery. Every Passover, I have to throw away my sourdough, and then I get a new batch from one of the local bakers who make sure to always have sourdough because it's their business. I just learned today, actually, in Shuk Machne Yehuda, one of the bakers, the way he makes his sourdough, this is a tradition they have from Iraq going back for centuries. They take hummus beans, which is Hebrew for garbanzo beans or chickpeas, and soak them in water. This is dried beans. They soak them in water, and you'll see that beans form like a froth or a foam on the top of the water. You use that froth and mix that with flour and water, and that becomes the basis for your sourdough, because that froth is also full of the really beneficial bacteria. So I mentioned that these bacteria are beneficial because at first you might think like, wow, this is so totally gross. Why do I want to be eating bacteria? So just so you know, your body is composed mostly of bacteria cells. You have more bacteria cells in your body than you have human cells in your body. And that's a really great thing because the bacteria produce all sorts of nutrients that you need. They help you digest your food. They digest parts of your food that you yourself can't digest. And they really make you a healthy and strong person. So we really like those bacteria, and we want to say thank you to the bacteria for being so nice to us. So basically what happens is once you have a sourdough starter, you're going to take it and mix it with water. Now remember I said that in here, this sourdough starter is chock full of bacteria and yeast that are naturally occurring in the air. And you might want to know, well, what's the difference between that and the yeast that you can buy in the store? So this is a whole symbiotic ecosystem of the bacteria and yeast that are naturally occurring in the air. So the yeast that you can get in the store that's made in a factory, it happens to be this one species of yeast that does something that's really great from a culinary baker standpoint, but not as good from a nutritional standpoint. And that is that it produces a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide, disproportionate to how much it's broken down the grain. So very quickly, you're able to get a very fluffy dough. The dough, remember I said how as the dough breaks down, it gets soupier, but because it gets fluffy really fast, it doesn't get a chance to get soupy. So you can get a fluffy dough that hasn't broken down all that much, and it'll rise very quickly. And that's how conventional yeast works. Now, the negative side of that is that within a handful of hours, you're able to make a bread. That sourdough, normally the way we make it, the way I'm going to show you, we normally have it rising from anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. So the dough is really getting broken down, which means that you don't have to do as much digestion in your stomach. The bacteria here are doing it for you rather than bacteria in your intestines doing it for you. And that's kind of cool. That's really great. And it's just easier to digest. Most people experience a sourdough being a bit lighter on their digestion, tasting a bit richer. You also get more of that sour flavor. If you don't like the sour flavor too much, so you need to test out how long you have it rising before it gets too sour. Okay, so now that I've been talking for so long, we see that the dough is just getting a lot softer. We started with a pretty dry dough, because that's what we ended up with last night when we were making bread. And this is going to be the bread that we're going to be eating tomorrow morning, so you have a frame of reference. We really do make this every single day. And it's not perfectly mixed in with the water, and it really doesn't need to be. It's nice if it is, but it totally doesn't need to be. We can go ahead and start our process. So remember, we took the dough, we added water. The only other ingredient that you need to have is salt. So you need about half a tablespoon of salt per pound of flour, which in European measurements is about a tablespoon of salt per kilo of flour. In addition to just giving great flavor to your dough, it actually helps the yeast rise. I don't know why this is, but it really helps with rising. When we first started making sourdough, my dough just wasn't rising, and a friend of mine said, "Are you putting in enough salt?" And once we did, boom, that made all the difference. So remember, a tablespoon of salt per kilo of flour or half a tablespoon per pound. So we have some really awesome Mediterranean sea salt right here. I don't really measure anymore. I just kind of use my eyes and take a guess, and it works out pretty good. The other ingredient, this is definitely not a necessity, but we find that the dough comes out yummier and more moist with a dash of olive oil. So for about this much water, I would use 1 to 2 tablespoons of oil. So you can see how much I've put in. And we're going to mix that in a little bit. We want the salt to dissolve so that it spreads out evenly through the dough. Now I've got my flour. I'm going to be really honest with you. I forgot flour when I was setting this up, and my husband made it magically appear, because that's what wonderful husbands are for. So one of the many things. So now we're going to add flour. This happens to be sprouted sourdough flour that someone from a town called Emmanuel, which is about an hour north of here, makes. But any flour will do, whether it's white or wheat, it really doesn't matter. As you can assume, I'm a big fan of whole grain flour because it's part of my whole grain life. But you can choose whatever flour you like. So I'm taking a guess as to how much flour I need. Usually you want about 2 cups of water per pound of flour, something like that. But you need to just practice the measurements. The neat thing about sourdough is that it's very forgiving. So you can have a drier dough or a wetter dough, and it doesn't matter. So once we get all of this mixed in, we are done, which is kind of crazy. Unlike yeasted bread, this bread does not have to be kneaded. You don't have to wait and then come back and pound it down and knead it again. We're just getting the flour and the water to mix. And I realize we're making an insane amount of sourdough. Because of all of my excitement to make this video, I added a lot of water. So you see it's starting to get drier now. So we had a soup. It's getting thicker. So the wetter the dough is, the faster it's going to rise. The negative side of that is if the dough is too wet, the water's just going to make it heavy. So it's going to have a hard time getting decent bubbles in it. And it's just going to be a heavy dough. It'll still be nutritious and good for you, but I don't know. It's just not so fun to bite into a very heavy dough. So already the way it is right now is totally fine. I happen to like something a bit drier. So I'm going to take some of this. So remember how we had a sourdough starter and you're like, where did that come from? It magically appeared in my container. We're going to magically make it reappear into the container now. So what's happening is that little bit of starter was basically a petri dish for all of these bacteria and yeast. And now we've mixed it with more flour, we've given it more food, so all those bacteria and yeast are just gonna repopulate that whole area even more. And that can just keep happening. We can do this process every single day, which we do in our home. We do this process every single day. We're gonna take a piece of this. Now in the refrigerator, because it's cold, it's gonna repopulate very slowly. I'm gonna add a little more flour and dry this out a little bit more. And I'm gonna add another ingredient that we've been adding to our bread for the past few months, ever since I found out how immensely potent flax seeds are. So I happen to have milled these flax seeds in my high-powered blender, but you can buy ground flax seeds in any store, any health food store. When you buy it in the store, if it smells like fish, that means it's already gone rancid. It should have like a nutty, fresh smell. This one kind of smells like bananas. So I know that sounds crazy, but we milled it ourselves. So I like to put 1 to 2 tablespoons per person, which is pretty much all of that. All of that, because it's good stuff. Chock full of omega-3 fatty acids, chock full of nutritious fiber and fats. It's really good for you. There are other things that you can put into your dough at this point. I recommend the additional things you put into your dough you do after you take out sourdough, which is why I put the sourdough aside already. So if you want to put seeds like sunflower seeds, or you want to put spices like rosemary, or a really cool spice called ketzach that we have here in Israel, now is a good time to do that. I don't recommend that you put either garlic or onions into your dough. If you want to add those ingredients, add them at the very last minute. Onions are notorious for absorbing, and garlic for absorbing viruses and bacteria, which is why they're such good things to take when you're sick, but you don't want them picking them up from the air and putting them into your food. So what I did, for example, yesterday morning is I cut a fresh onion and I put slivers right on top of our bread right before we baked it, and it just gave the bread an extra yummy, sweet, tangy taste. So now you can see the dough is a bit drier. Remember I said that the way the dough was before was also fine? Even drier than this would be okay. You don't want it to be hard as a rock, because then it might just take a little bit too long to rise. So now you can imagine that this dough, as it breaks down, is going to get soupier and soupier and soupier, which means that it's not going to hold its shape. So if I really wanted to, I could make this very dry, I could braid it, I can make it beautiful, I could do whatever I want to it. But if I have it rising overnight, which is what we do here in our home, it's all just going to go flat and bleh, kind of like a blob. And so it seems like a pity for me to put all this work into shaping something that's going to end up a blob anyway. So what do? We take, yes, another wonderful thing provided by my awesome husband Dave, a baking dish. Any baking dish with parchment paper will do. I recommend that you not use Teflon. or that new ceramic stuff that's like Teflon, because the moisture in the dough will literally peel the Teflon off of the tin. That's not taking into account all the toxic substances that are inside of Teflon, for which I don't recommend use Teflon anyway, but particularly for the bread, it's going to ruin your pan. So this is a silicone pan. This is made in Europe. It's 100% silicone. What's great about silicone is that the bread just pops right out of it. We just go like that and it just pops right out. But parchment paper, here it's called baking paper, also works really well in any baking container that you have. So I'm going to put my bread into my container. And we've been talking for a while, but you see actual work has been about 5 minutes of work. And ladies and gentlemen, we are done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this just the way that it is, and I'm going to put it in the oven. And I'm not going to turn the oven on. I'm just going to wait. So let's say you put it in at 8 o'clock at night. In the morning, 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, you just turn the oven on, and it doesn't need to preheat. As the oven is heating up, it's going to help the dough get that last punch of rising, and that's really fantastic. And it can bake at about 200 degrees Celsius or 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about half an hour to 40 minutes, depending on whether you're making rolls or a loaf. If you're making a loaf, you need 40 to 45 minutes. If you're making rolls, then I recommend about half an hour. And again, in the morning, I could chop up some garlic or onions and put them right on top of the bread. Now, one thing that I will mention is right now here in Jerusalem, it's winter. And the cold weather I mentioned is going to make the dough rise more slowly. So sometimes at night, especially if we're not making the dough early enough and we want to make sure it's risen by morning, we'll just warm up the oven just a tad. Not so that it's hot enough that you can burn yourself, but just so that it feels warm, like a warm, moist environment. And that'll get the yeast and the bacteria going a little bit more. They really like a warm environment. In the summer, for sure, we don't do that just because the natural heat that's in the air is going to help everything move along. So the reason that I keep it in the oven, it doesn't have to be kept in the oven. It could be kept on the countertop with a moist cloth on top. The reason we like the oven is because we don't have to put the moist cloth on top, and we've had to take a lot of moist cloths and throw them into the laundry because the dough stuck to the moist cloth. And the oven has, because it's perfectly sealed, it keeps a perfect even humidity so that the dough doesn't dry out. Whereas in your countertop, it's just going to lose a lot of its moisture because it's exposed to just the regular outside environment. So hopefully in the morning we'll bake the bread, it'll taste delicious, it'll be really nutritious, and it's a much less expensive way to make bread for my family. A lot of times we just make sandwiches from that. We can send friends, we can send our son to school with that bread. Our son doesn't go to school, he schools at home, so he eats it fresh, but theoretically that's something that you can do. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments or amazing praise, I ask that you put them in the comments below. I'm so looking forward to hearing from you. Again, remember that I am a personal growth and wellness guide, and I'm happy to help you in your search for clarity, vibrance, and joy.